My step-grandparents try to take my newborn daughter. I still can't believe what happened almost 20 years ago. My husband and I had only been married
A year now. He hires guys like me to fix up houses that a realty company buys. He's a real character, always yelling and complaining about prices and how long it takes to do things. He doesn't make a secret of the fact that he wants to get the most work done for the least amount of money. He's been doing this for years, and he doesn't shy away from telling everyone that he's the boss. When you're working for him, you learn to keep your mouth shut and do what you're told. I used to be a plumber, and I'm still pretty good at it, but working with contractor isn't easy. He's always looking for someone to blame if something goes wrong. When it comes to money, contractor's tough. I remember it was tax season and he gave everyone else their W-2s. I was working on a project for him in the city, and he called me over to the house in the suburbs he was renting. He said he needed a few extra hands on a quick project, so I stopped what I was doing and rushed over there. He's one of those guys who is all, buddy, and, my house is your house. He ended up giving me a 1099, and called it a tax form. I was a little confused since it wasn't a typical W-2. I even told him that I was missing some money. I was frustrated because he was always so quick to shout at people about things, but when I asked about the missing money, he seemed more concerned about whether or not I was making a big deal out of it. He kept saying he lost my tax form and to relax and stop stressing. He had just gotten a $25,000 Rolex and was talking about going to the Hamptons, but he was mad that I wanted the right amount of money. That's when I decided I didn't want to be a subcontractor anymore. At the end of the day, I realized contractor was pretty well off. He was making a ton of money. I figured I was being pretty undervalued. He would boast about making over $2 million a year, but the $16 an hour I was making for a 10-hour workday just seemed wrong. I worked hard, but it felt like I was making him rich. It was frustrating. I thought, if he's making so much money, why am I making so little? Why couldn't I be on his level? One day, I felt brave enough to ask for a raise. I was ready to move up. He just laughed in my face. He said something like, "What do you think this is, a charity? I'm not here to make you rich." He told me to work harder, and that was the end of the conversation. I wasn't sure what to do next, but I didn't want to just accept being treated unfairly. So, I worked extra hard, doing even more than what he asked. I was the first one in every morning and the last one out. I wanted him to see my work ethic. I was determined to prove myself. A few months later, I tried again. Instead of asking for a raise, I tried a different approach. I said, how could I make myself even more useful to the company? We both would make more money if I was more productive. I'm sure there is something I can do. I figured he'd think I was just trying to help and he might finally see how much I wanted to work for him. Instead, he was kind of rude and told me to just focus on the work. Then, he added, get a van and a trailer. Then maybe we can talk about more money. He didn't even look me in the eye. I was confused. Why a van and a trailer? Why did that make any difference? It seemed like another way to make me do more work without making more money. I was starting to see the writing on the wall, so I started working a few side jobs to try to earn some extra money. I needed to save up so that maybe one day I could afford that van and trailer. I knew that it wouldn't get me the raise I was looking for, but it was better than nothing. I worked long hours and saved as much as I could, sometimes not even eating for days. Contractors started noticing. He would say stuff like, you really know your stuff, you're doing good work, or, I need to get you a reward for doing such good work. He looked at me differently, like he was starting to see me as someone important, like he needed me. I could practically hear the dollar signs clinking in his head. Then one day, I did it. I bought a van, my dad's old Ford, a real gas guzzler. And, I found a cheap, rusty little trailer, not even a nice one, just a 5x10 trailer that needed some repairs. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something. The next morning, I came to work with the van and trailer trailing behind. I smiled big at contractor and said, you know, I was finally able to get that van and trailer. Now we can really make some money. I expected him to be impressed. Maybe even a little proud of me. I had done what he asked, and now I was ready to take on more responsibility. He just looked at me, gave me a blank stare, and mumbled, cool, before getting into his truck and driving away. I felt deflated. What was that all about? I felt stupid and disappointed. I didn't know what I was doing wrong. I thought maybe he was just preoccupied, so I waited until the end of the day, hoping he'd calm down and we could talk about it. I decided to remind him. I went to his office and said, you know, I got the van and trailer just like we talked about. I'm ready to be more helpful and do even more. He gave me that sharp, cynical look and said, What are you talking about? I never said anything about any van and trailer. Yes, you did. I said. You said if I got a van and trailer that I could get paid more. That's why I bought them. What's going on? I was really starting to lose it. He looked at me, his jaw clenched, and said, I never said any of that shush tea. If you want anything, then you have to work for it. It was like a bucket of ice water being poured on my head. I just stared at him for a second, trying to process what he had said. My jaw dropped. I couldn't believe it. I felt so humiliated, so defeated. I was ready to explode. But I was so used to his behavior that I simply mumbled, yes, sir, and walked out. It was time to move on. Adam, the electrician, he's a really nice guy. He's one of the few people who I felt like I could actually talk to, the kind of guy who is willing to listen. I'd been complaining to him about my boss, telling him that I was looking for a better job. Don't even bother looking, he said. You don't get ahead working for him, kiddo. This is about learning and becoming your own boss. He just keeps telling me I need to work for it, I said. Adam smiled, shook his head, and said, you're not supposed to be working for him to get to the top. That's not how things work with him. You're supposed to learn as much as you can. Work with him until you know everything about the business. Then, you do your own thing. He's not your mentor, he's your first boss. He taught you the ropes, now it's your turn. What do you mean? I said. What's the point if I'm just going to learn to become the boss of a shush TTY company? He laughed and patted me on the back. It's not about him. It's about you. What you learn from him, you can take it and make it better. What do you mean? I asked. He said, you're a good worker, and you know what you're doing. You're a natural. Why don't you try to get your contractor's license? Then, you can call the shots. You don't have to wait around for someone to give you a raise, you can do it yourself. I hadn't thought about that. I always thought about it as getting ahead in this specific company, but maybe he was right. It wasn't about this company, it was about me. I thought, if contractor could make all this money, why couldn't I? I knew what I had to do. I spent weeks learning everything I could about how to become a general contractor in my state. I found books to read, but they were expensive. I knew I couldn't afford them while I was still working for contractor and paying my bills and raising a family. I needed some extra income. Then I found a group in my neighborhood who needed a handyman, doing a little bit of everything. It was perfect. It was like learning how to run my own company but under the radar. I took what I had learned from plumbing and from working with contractor, and I learned some new stuff, like installing cabinets and fixing fences. I made good money, and the work was getting me the kind of experience that would help me start my own business. I made good money, and it was pretty satisfying. One day, I was at the gas station filling my van with gas. I couldn't believe how much gas cost. That's when I had my big idea. If I was going to get my contractor's license, and if I wanted to have my own business, I didn't have to wait for contractor. He was being such a shush tea. Why work for him when I could do it on my own? I was good enough. Maybe I could even make more money than he was. I had references from all the customers I was doing side jobs for, and I had learned the business. I researched how to start my own company. It wasn't easy. You need a lot of stuff, a business license, an LLC, insurance. It was more complicated than I thought, and there were so many rules and regulations. It took a while to get everything squared away, but I was determined to make it happen. I felt like I had been working towards this my whole life. When I was younger, I worked construction with my father and had done a bunch of different things with him around the house. I felt like I had a foundation. After months of saving money and jumping through hoops, I finally got to take the contractor's license exam. I was ready, but it was a 3-hour drive to get to the exam center and I had to pay $300. It was Tuesday, and I was still working for contractor. That meant missing work and spending more money. I had never been to the testing center before, so I was worried that I would miss it, that something would go wrong. I could feel my stomach knotting up with anxiety as I drove. The testing center was just a little storefront, cramped and kind of rundown. There were 3 other people there taking tests. The person who was overseeing the exam was a grumpy old woman, and she told everyone not to use their cell phones. I knew I was ready for the exam, so I was relaxed, even though it was a big deal. I was taking notes, reading through the questions, and checking my answers. I felt confident. But then, time ran out. I still had a few questions left. I was bummed, but I tried to focus on the questions I had answered. When the grumpy old woman finally took the test and I turned it in, she said, "You failed." I felt defeated, frustrated, angry. I had done all this work to get ready for the exam, and now I wasn't even going to get a second chance. I wanted to shout, "No, that's not true." I tried to find someone who would tell me that it was a mistake, that I had really passed. I almost thought that maybe this whole thing had been a big waste of time. I didn't want to give up, but I was ready to accept that I might not be a general contractor after all. I left the testing center, drove back home, and went straight to bed. I felt so defeated, but the next morning I woke up feeling a little better. A week later, I found out I had a baby boy. He was beautiful and healthy and was everything I had ever dreamed of. When I was finally able to put him to sleep, I thought, maybe it's not about me. Maybe it's about him. I thought about my childhood. I'd grown up in trailer parks, often going hungry and always getting made fun of at school for the clothes I wore. Even though I felt ashamed sometimes, I at least had a roof over my head. I always wanted video games that my friends had, but my parents couldn't afford them. I always wished I could go to a water park, but it just wasn't a possibility. I only went to a water park once, when I was a teenager, and my friend's parents brought me. Looking at my baby boy, I wanted so much for him. He deserved more than I had. He deserved the things that were important to me. I needed to get my license. I couldn't let this be it. I wouldn't let him have the kind of childhood that I did. I was ready to do whatever it took. I worked even more, saving every penny I could, and I retook the exam. I was determined to get my contractor's license, and I was prepared to go through hell and high water to do it. I took practice tests online and read everything I could about contractor's licenses and construction laws, even going through my old textbooks from plumbing school. I wanted to be ready for anything they threw at me. When the day came, I was still nervous, but this time, I passed. I felt like I could breathe again. I could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. With my new license in hand, I started thinking about what to do next. I was finally going to become the boss. It had been a long, frustrating road, but I'd made it. I had learned a lot, and now I had the skills and the experience to do what I wanted to do. Over the past few months, I had become friends with the owner of the realty company. We would talk at barbecues and play golf. I knew he had a good heart and he liked me. It made sense to befriend the guy who was paying my boss. He seemed like he'd be a lot more reasonable and understanding than my boss. I would try to casually talk about things with him. I mentioned how expensive it was for the houses to be built and fixed, and how much money contractor was making. Sometimes, he would nod along, seeming